Хорошо.
Теймен Пронк, Proto Slavic Accent Paradigm D and U stems. Прославянская акцентная парадигма D и U основы. Теймен, пожалуйста.
Большое спасибо. Я буду говорить по-английски. Can you all see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Then I'll. So I'm going to talk about the Proto-Slavic U stems and about their accentuation. Of course, about the accentuation because this conference is for Vladimir Dybо. So this I thought would be an appropriate subject. And the U stems in Slavic already at a very early stage started to merge with the Proto-European O stems. And this process started in the Common Slavic period. And this happened because in Common Slavic, the accusative singular endings and accusative plural endings of the O and U stems had merged phonetically. So therefore the paradigms had become more similar and they started to merge. As a result of that, the nominative singular of the O stems was at some point replaced by that of the U stems, and the reason for that is probably because it merged with the ending of the neuter, so therefore it was not a very useful ending, and it was replaced by the ending of the U stem. So the Common Slavic situation that arose as a result of this was the following, where you can see that still the O stems and U stems are largely separated. So the nominative singular, accusative singular, and accusative plural endings are identical, but the rest of the endings are different. Now this quickly changed after the disintegration of Common Slavic. And in the individual languages, the O and U stems are never retained as separate categories. And it's actually quite difficult to establish which nouns belong to which declension type in Proto-Slavic. And also we see that the new merged paradigms of the O and U stems always contain both O and U stem elements. And you can clearly see this in Russian, for example. So in the right-hand column, you see the Russian endings, and the orange color indicates whether they match the O or U stems. And basically, on the basis of the Russian endings, it's impossible to tell whether the Russian paradigm continues the O stems or the U stems, right? It's a real merger of the two. So one of the questions in the literature is which nouns originally belong to the U stems. And there is general agreement only about some 6 nouns that they belong to the U stems, and for the rest there is no consensus. So those 6 nouns are dom, syn, vol, pol, virch, and miot. And for all the others, some people would say they're U stems, but others would say they're not. So this is a difficulty, and we'll see that accentuation may help to solve this problem. So which criteria are being used to identify U stems? The first criterion to identify U stems is the preservation of unambiguous U stem forms in the older sources, so Old Church Slavonic, Old Czech, Old Russian. The second criterion is the occurrence of a U stem case ending instead of a dominant O stem ending. So for some nouns with a Russian locative in U, that may be argued that that's a remnant of an older U stem. Also, fixed expressions are being used as an argument. So, for example, in Russian, sverhu, izdamu, otradu. Also, derivatives containing the element of or v. Some scholars actually look outside Slavic to identify Slavic U stems. That's criterion number 5. I don't think this is actually a very good argument. The sixth argument comes from borrowings into Finnic, where the borrowing ends in U or U in the Finnic languages, not in I or A, as with other borrowings. And the seventh argument comes from accentuation, and this is the argument we'll focus on today. Now, it's important to realize that even though there was a merger of O and U stems in Slavic, what we find in the attested languages are actually secondary distributions. So often there's a confusion of the original distribution. You get secondary patterns. So, for example, semantics start to play a role. In the Russian genitive, the original U stem ending U clearly has a partitive meaning. In Czech, the original U stem ending ovi of the dative singular is clearly used with, productively used with animates, like in bratrovi or psovi. So semantics play a role. Another reason for a secondary spread of U stem endings is to avoid the effects of palatalization when a stem ends in a velar. So in Slovenian, for example, the plurals Wiltsi, Bozi, and Rozi were replaced by U-stem-looking forms like Vokovi, Bogovi, and Rogovi, simply to avoid the palatalization. And this is actually found in other languages as well. I've used Slovenian as an example here, but you see the same pattern everywhere. And finally, there's a secondary spread of U-stem endings on the basis of accentuation. So, for example, in Slovenian again, a falling tone on the root can cause the introduction of U-stem endings. For example, veter with a neo-circumflex has obtained a new plural vetrovi. But also monosyllabic stems, for example, grad, the word for castle, has a genitive senior gradu, known as plural gradovi, clearly after the model of, for example, most, mostu, mostovi. This only happens with nouns with mobile accentuation. Similarly, in Serbian and Croatian, in mobile nouns with a monosyllabic stem, we see the spread of the ovi ending for the plural. And you can clearly see in the historical data that then this also spread to nouns with predominant end stress of the type grobovi, križevi. But the nouns with fixed stress on the stem clearly lagged behind, so there you find more traces of original forms without ovi, like, for example, Raci next to Rakovi. So there are all kinds of secondary distributions, and we have to take this into account when we look at the history of the U-stems. Now let's have a look at the influence of the U-stems on accentuation. And an interesting example here is the Russian type of masculine nouns where we have root stress in the singular but end stress in the plural of the type цвет, цвета, цветы, цветов. Now, if you look at older sources of Russian, it's well known that actually quite a few nouns belonging to this type in modern Russian have dominant root stress in the plural in earlier Russian in the 16th and 17th centuries. And it's interesting to see that those examples that do actually have this end stress in these older texts tend to be original U-stems. So we find forms like syny, mosty, and domy in these older sources. And if we take a look at the very useful retrograde dictionary of Zalesniak from 2011, we see more examples of that. So already in 1922, Heiko Nachtigal observed that there's a connection between the Russian accent type and original U-stems. So here's a list of original U-stems or words that have been argued to be U-stems on other grounds as well, where we find this type of accentuation. And the words that I've marked in red also occur with end stress or are attested with end stress in the 16th and 17th century sources. So what exactly is the explanation for this? Well, there are several explanations in the literature. Stang, for example, argued that the whole type with end stress here is actually based on oxytone U-stems of the type Vierch and Vol. This may be the case, but the problem here is that this is only a very small group of nouns. So the question is, how did that become so productive? So what must have played a role as well here, as was observed by Nachtigal, but also by Shakhmatov around the same time, is that end stress duals of mobile U-stems of the type Syny must have played an important role in the spread of end stress as well. And this can be compared to the spread of the dual ending a as a plural marker in Russian. Right? So in both cases, we see this plural marker spreading to other cases. And I think this is an important observation, and it goes a long way towards explaining why we find this type in Russian. An additional reason for the spread of end stress here is no doubt also the introduction of the genitive plural ending of from the U-stems, which was stressed in mobile words. Right, so I think a combination of these factors caused the rise of this paradigm. Now we also find in the literature that some of the nouns belonging to this type in modern Russian go back to an accent paradigm D in Proto Slavic. And I don't think that for this particular type that's necessary, but we'll look at accent paradigm D in a minute. So in the examples that we've seen so far, we've seen that accentuation often plays a very important role in the spread of U-stem features. Right, so we have to constantly take into account the accentuation of words when we talk about the U-stems. And I think that will be the most important point of my talk today. So let's have a look at accent paradigm D now. The classical Proto-Slavic accent paradigms are the accent paradigms usually labeled as paradigms A, B, and C. Accent paradigm A with root stress, accent paradigm B with end stress, and accent paradigm B or predominant end stress, and accent paradigm C with mobile stress. Right? And I've given the Russian examples here, but most of you will be aware of examples from other Slavic languages as well. Now, on the basis of an observation by Universiteit in the 1960s, Dybо and colleagues posited an accent paradigm D in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And this paradigm combines features of accent paradigms B and C. So now I've listed the Proto-Slavic accent paradigms B, C, and D next to each other. These are reconstructions. The right-hand column contains accent paradigm D, and you can see that the nominative singular form and also accusative singular has a falling tone on the root, like accent paradigm C, and it also loses the accents to clitics, whereas the oblique cases have end stress, like accent paradigm B. Right, so it's sort of a mixture of the two paradigms. And the evidence for this additional fourth paradigm mainly comes from Czechoslovakian dialects of Croatian, Kosovo-Resava dialects of Serbian, and from East Slavic. And the East Slavic material contains, amongst others, the end-stressed plurals that we've just seen, which I think should be explained differently, but also many dialectal forms. And there's a very good article with lots of material and discussion by Nikolai from 2012 that contains so much of the material. So I'll be using that here as well. Now, it's important to realize that the predicted distribution of O and U stems with paradigms B, C, and D all separated is actually never preserved. Instead, we find mixed systems. So on the basis of sort of mixed paradigms, we have to reconstruct the original situation, which makes our work a bit difficult. But it also raises the question whether maybe we can explain the material without having to reconstruct an additional accent paradigm in Proto-Slavic. And what I'll argue here is that that is indeed the case. So let's first have a look at the dialectal East Slavic forms. And Nikolai lists a lot of material from the Pskov Polotsk dialects and Carpathian Ukrainian dialects. And what I've done here is I've taken the examples that he gives where we find both baritone and oxytone forms, both well attested. And if you make a list of that, you see that many of those words are actually old U stems. They're also listed as such in Nikolai's paper, right? So this is not only my observation. So I've marked those in orange here. So those would be words for which there are otherwise also arguments to reconstruct them as U stems. And what's also striking is that of the remaining words, at least half have a stem ending in a velar, which we've seen before is often a motive for introducing U stem endings and U stem accentuation. Right, so by simply looking at these forms, you wonder whether perhaps this is actually like the end stress of the modern Russian plurals is maybe related to the U stems rather than to an accent paradigm D. And the question is, of course, how do you get the attested paradigms? So let's have a look at two words that show especially a lot of variation within these dialects, and therefore they clearly show what's going on here. So those are Sat, which Nikolai lists as belong to accent paradigm C, and the Rok, which he lists as belong to accent paradigm D, and I've normalized the notation here. So what you find are four types of paradigms. One where you have Sat, Sadl, Sadlom, so initial stress in the genitive but end stress in the instrumental. Then there's a paradigm with end stress, Sat, Sadul, Sadlom. There's a paradigm with initial stress, Sat, Sadl, Sadam. And there are a few dialects that have a pattern Sat, Sadul, but Sadam with initial stress in the instrumental. Can we explain all these forms from U stem paradigms? I think we can. So let's now take the reconstructed O and U stem forms belonging to accent paradigms B and C. So I'm leaving out D now. Now, well, let's see whether this is sufficient to explain. So the pattern sad, sadel, sadom appears to contain the accentuation of the mobile O stems, but with an additional form from the U stems in the instrumental singular. Now, this would not be surprising because we know that the endings of the instrumental of the O and U stem merged phonetically, right? So you get rodom next to mastom. And if we look at the neighboring West Slavic languages, we see that there the U stem ending was actually generalized. So dialects with this type of accentuation appear to be dialects where the U stem ending was generalized in the masculine nouns. So we understand this perfectly without having to reconstruct accent paradigm D. The type with N stress simply continues the U stem accentuation. Sadul, sadum. The type with initial stress continues the O stem accentuation. Sadul, sadum. So we're left with this handful of dialects where you find sad, sadul, but sadum. And here it appears to be the case that we're dealing with O stems into which the genitive singular ending U with its stress was introduced. So that would explain the distribution here. I think it would be interesting to have another look at these dialects to see to what extent the distribution of the ending U in the genitive would confirm this. But on the basis of the material available, I find it very difficult to determine whether that's the case. So I think we can conclude that on the basis of the East Slavic forms, we don't necessarily have to reconstruct an accent paradigm D, right? So the East Slavic forms are ambiguous. They're not speaking against accent paradigm D, but we can explain all the attested material without doing so. So let's have a look at South Slavic then. And let's first look at what happens to the U stems, because there are a number of U stem nouns that end up as either accent paradigm B or accent paradigm C, at least on the face of it. So this is, for example, bor, bora, which is also attested as bor, bora, as if it belongs to accent paradigm B. Now, if we look at the reconstructed mobile U stems, most, mostu, mostu, mostume, you see that the first type is simply based on the nominative accusative form, so bor, bora, but the second type is based on the oblique cases with end stress. So that's why you get these two paradigms in Serbian and Croatian. And there are more nouns like this. So we also find the same variants with plot and plot, where there are clear indications of an original U stem in other languages. And also bok, also in Slovenian, by the way, bok. So both variants exist next to each other. And this too appears to be an old U stem. For example, if you look at Old Russian, there appear to be traces of that. So this is what happened in to mobile U stems in South Slavic. And if we now look at the evidence for accent paradigm D, it looks familiar to us. So if we take Susak material, and it's been argued in the literature that it's quite difficult to use the Susak material because the sources are unreliable, but I'll take a few examples where I think everyone agreed that they're reliable. And what we see here are the same two words, bok and plot, which in Susak are bok, boka, and plot, plota. And there's also nuas, nosa, which looks like a genuine form, and that too is an original U stem. We have to be very careful with the Susak data because, as Langston has shown, clearly some of the alleged paradigm D forms there are secondary after accent paradigm B words. So it's a bit difficult. So let's have a look at other dialects. And then it turns out that one of the most frequent words that shows accent paradigm D patterns is the word for bridge. For example, in Stegersbach in the Burgenland, we find moas, mosta. And in Resian Slovenian, we find mus, mosta. So this must be an archaism. And this looks very much like our reconstructed U stem paradigm. And it gets even better if we look at the paradigm as it is attested in Seine, where we find most, mosta, mosto, mosto, moston, which perfectly follows the accentuation of the Proto Slavic model U stem. So my conclusion is that the post-Common Slavic merge of the O and U stem also strongly affected the accentuation of these words, and that mixed paradigms arose locally. but also that there's actually no evidence left for the reconstruction of a late Common Slavic accent paradigm D in the O or U stems. What we do find, however, is the accent paradigm capital D, as it's often called by dialectologists, in the later individual languages. But as I've said, I think in most cases this actually eventually continues mobile U stems, or mobile U stem accentuation. Sometimes spread to other words, like the endings of the U stems also sometimes spread to other words. This doesn't mean that the material for accent paradigm D is not important. I think it's very important. And I think accentuation must be taken into account much more when we talk about the Proto-Slavic U stems, and also when we try to identify old U and O stems. And I think this study should start with the material that was collected by Professor Dybă and other scholars in his school. So that would be my conclusion, is that we actually have to depart from these, or to start from their works when we want to study the original paradigms of the Proto-Slavic U stems. Thank you very much for your attention.
Теймен, thank you very much. And now to questions and remarks. Пожалуйста, вопросы, замечания. Mata.
Yeah, I have two questions. First, you said that in Stokavian there's a tendency for central paradigm A to preserve the short plural Ratsi, but Gradovi, and I don't know which examples you had, but this is not, I think for standard Stokavian this is not correct, because you have prsti in A, fingers, you have zubi in C, teeth, and you have, for instance, koni, horses, in B, so you have all three, and I don't think there's a tendency, at least in standard Stokavian, to have to preserve it more in accentual paradigm A, and the form you produced Ratsi, that's not really used in like standard language or in general Stokavian, that's like poetic or archaic or dialectal. So
Sure.
It's not a good example, and you can't really, I mean, it's difficult to say. So for standard language, I don't think that works, and in dialects they're really the systems are really different, so it's not the same in all dialects. So that's the first remark, and the second remark is I don't think it's really appropriate to say that the data from Susak is not reliable, because you mentioned Schrager, and she has shown that accentual paradigm D, at least synchronically, is there. And I think you were also at my presentation 2 years ago in Ljubljana, where I also showed that at least I mean, we can disagree about the diachronics and the history and how it got there, but synchronically, accentual paradigm D in Susak does exist, and it's very robust. I mean, if you don't believe my data, I can give you my page so you can listen for yourself. I mean,
I think you misunderstand.
That's the way they say it. So,
Matt, I think you misunderstand me. I definitely accept that. I think that I said that very explicitly, that it does exist synchronically.
No, but you said the data from Susak is unreliable.
No,
it's not anymore.
No, that's not what I said. What I said is that some of the data that has been adduced in the literature about Susak is unreliable, and that is of course mainly the data that was collected by Hraste in this famous description from 1956.
Yeah, but that's also actually not true.
So the problem is that there's even within that description there are contradictions. So the only thing I wanted to say is that there's some discussion about these data. So what I try to do here is to cite some forms that I think everyone would agree on that they are reliable. So it's actually the opposite from what you're saying. I definitely think that accent paradigm D does exist on Susak and also in other places, and that we too should take it seriously.
Yeah, the problem with Susak is that what Vermeer said about the description is that was methodologically correct, but actually it turns out that what Hraste wrote was not really so unreliable. I mean, the forms he adduced were actually, most of them were correct. So yeah. So it was useful to be, suspicious, but it turned out not to be actually true.
Yeah, but we completely agree on this, Mate. This is we don't disagree. I'm in complete agreement with you. I think we should take these forms very seriously, and not only from Tulsak, but also from other places from other dialects. The question is the only question that I wanted to ask is how to explain them, right? And as for the other remark about the Stokhaven, yes, of course, you're right that actually this. The spread of the OV ending is a very complicated story, and it's different in different dialects, right? So this is a generalization based on some of the dialects and on the literature on some of these systems. So it's one of the patterns that we find. But you're completely right, of course, that this is not the whole story, nor that it's also not true for all Stokhaven dialects. So that's a useful addition, I think.
Yeah. У меня маленький вопрос, но по-русски не буду говорить вам. Какое отношение ко всему вот этому кругу материала имеет славянские формы типа граду, градови и так далее, которые являются просто фонетическим переносом циркумфлекса славянского на слог вправо? Вы приводили их наряду с типом как-то славянско-русского моста, предположим, и тут же у вас было славянское граду. Но это же не имеет никакого отношения друг к другу. Оно совершенно разного происхождения, и славянский здесь материал совершенно не релевантен ни для чего. Ни для Б, ни для С, ну, в общем-то, говоря, для это внутриславянские дела.
I find it very difficult to hear you, but I think if I understand your question correctly, you're asking what to do about the accentuation of the genitive in U in Slovenian with N stress of the type gradu. Yeah, I think that's something that I've also been thinking about a lot. So I actually agree with your reconstruction for the mobile paradigm that it had originally had a neoacute on the ending, on the U, but that doesn't explain the Slovenian form. So my guess is that the Slovenian form would be perhaps be analogical to the dative, because you get this introduction of U in the paradigm, and the ending is actually identical to the dative, and most of these words, so they have this mobile accentuation, and my guess would be that they took over the initial stress of the dative and also introduce that into the genitive. But it's an ad hoc explanation. I don't have a better explanation for that.
Ну да, в случае в славянском эти окончания типа градовый, граду, града, там есть в диалектах как угодно, с циркумфлексом, они имеют совершенно другую интонацию, чем то, что мы имеем в родительном поверх мосту, ну, в Б и в Д парадигме. Таким образом, они вообще выходят за пределы дискуссии. Зачем они были приведены, я не понимаю. Они просто сбивают с толку. Они рисуют такую картину, что якобы и в славянском есть вот эти конечные окончания. Их там нет. Это вторичное ударение, перенесенное с первого слога.
Oh, I see. Yes. Well, no, I never wanted to claim that. Of course, these forms with end stress originally go back to forms with initial stress due to the shift of the circumflex in Slovenian. But the point is that they all have mobile accentuation, right? So they still belong to the mobile type. But yeah, of course, you're right that the accent in that particular form is different from the one that you find in, for example, in Russian. Yeah.
Есть ли еще вопросы?